Welcome to Ideas of India, a podcast where we examine academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti and this is the 2021 Job Market series where I speak with young scholars entering the academic job market about their latest research on India. I spoke with Dr. Gaurav Mittal. Gaurav recently received his Ph.D. from the Department of Geography at the National University of Singapore. He also holds a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's degree in urban policy and governance from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in India. We discussed his job market paper titled The State and the Production of Informalities in Urban Transport, Vikrams in Dehradun, India, published in Geoforum, and also his dissertation titled Governing Transport, Ordering the City, Political Geographies of Everyday Mobilities in Dehradun and Shillong. We talked about informal versus formal public transportation, the difference between illegality and informality, questions of sovereignty and the state-citizen relationship, special interests in local transportation, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi Gaurav, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Shruti, for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here, actually.
Yeah, I am really excited about your research because I grew up in New Delhi. I have been part of the generation that has seen the urban explosion and also the urban transportation crisis worsen. I was the generation that was hugely impacted by the CNG decisions in Delhi, which destroyed the bus fleet and then, completely changed the nature of how we think about public transport and private transport and this kind of intermediate zone that the courts and the governments have kind of pushed us into. So I'm actually very, very excited, both from my personal experience and otherwise for this research. So in one of the papers that you sent me, which is talking about urban transportation in Dehradun, in Uttaranchal, you specifically look at the urban transport provided by Vikrams. These are basically autos that carry 7-8 passengers. In some other cities, they call fatfats and, they have like lots of local names. And technically, they are not supposed to ply a fixed route. They're supposed to work more like private transportation. But in the absence of better mass transit and public transit, in the form of public buses and so on, they in fact run a fixed route, right? That's what has happened. And because of this, they're either labeled illegal by the courts or they're labeled informal by economists, who are thinking about this from a market and emergence point of view. But none of this quite describes what is going on. And you have a very interesting approach to this problem. So can you walk us through what is going on in this landscape?
Sure, thanks. What is happening is that generally when you see the literature on urban transport, you would see that there is a positivist approach which most of the people apply to study transport. And for them, informal transport becomes a category. There is something called public transport, of course. Then there is a category of informal transport which had actually come in the literature since 1990s and all. Like, of course, the informality literature itself came in late 80s, early 90s, after Desato's work, Kevin Hart's work in urban studies. In transport also, it almost came around the same time. And it created this category of informal transport. So when I started my PhD research, I just wanted to study transport. For me, I didn't go by these categorization of public transport, informal transport. And if you look at the definition of public transport, the technical definitions of public transport, which many scholars have developed over a period of time, you will see that those are fairly straight definitions. They will talk about point-to-point service. They will talk about how the vehicle should take individual passengers rather than fly by booking. And then they will talk about mass capacity of vehicle through which they are going to carry the passengers. And I was like, okay, if this is the definition, then Vikrams in Dehradun are public transport. Now, when I reach the field, then I see that these same transport is categorized as informal transport. And I was like, what is this? What is informal transport? And then I get into this literature on informal transport and how most of the transport in global south is informal transport. That is one big thing which scholars talk about. they generally give a commonplace understanding of formal transport as a spontaneous, self-regulating, entrepreneurial aggregate. So, in some sense, they say that this is the transport which runs in absence of state regulation. They are the people who are applying transport, like they are entrepreneurs and they are running in absence of state regulation. And that is where my paper, my research comes in, that it is not in violation of state regulations, but it is because of the state's regulations or state's decisions that the transport become informal.
It's not the nature of the transportation that is informal or ad hoc. It's not that these people are not providing the valuable service. It's because the government regulation has created such a mess when it comes to public transit. There is no other way to provide or cater to the demand other than act within the informal sector or in the shadow of this regulation.
Exactly, exactly. You are right. So that is the thing. And it is not that these people make this transport informal by themselves. It is actually the government which makes the transport informal. And that is what my paper talks about. I mean, as many people would know, informality has a big set of literature in urban studies. There are scholars like Ananya Roy, Ayana Datta, Gautam Bhan, who have done really good work in India urban sector, talking about informality. And they have shown that how to understand the urban life in global south, it is important to understand the notion of informality. One important distinction they make in their work is the distinction between informality and illegality. Ayana Datta has book called The Illegal City, where she talks about that how informal is not illegal. But at the same time, when we come to transport, the informal becomes illegal. It becomes something which is in violation of law, which people have been operating just by themselves. And my paper says that it is not. My paper shows how, and it traces the history of Vikrams to 1970s. And it shows that how, when the Vikrams were actually introduced, the state, the transport department gave them a permit which will not allow them to operate on fixed routes. Although at the same times, the same officials who were giving them that permit were asking them to apply on specific routes, on fixed routes. So that is where the, let's say, the kernel of informality of Vikram's age. And since then, it just keeps growing. It
Yeah.
just keeps growing because of different regulations.
And I have looked at the other end of this problem, which is from the point of view of the constitutional courts and the Supreme Court and the high courts. And they have interpreted and made the problem worse, right? They call these illegal. They've done this with buses in Delhi. They've done this with slums in Delhi. Now, the other parts of informal transport, they're basically like a demolition machine, right? Anuj Bhuvania has written in detail about this from the constitutional perspective. So you're absolutely right that there's nothing ad hoc about them except that they are trapped in these kind of definitions. And if the government just understood how people actually use the transport and made the regulation according to it, there would be no problem. But you are explicitly preventing, for no good reason, these Vikrams from plying on a fixed route and picking up people and dropping off people where they wish to be picked up and dropped off. And because you can't give them the relevant permit, they become illegal or informal or something like that.
When you see that, of course, court will give the rulings based on the acts, which are, like in the case of transport, it is Motor Vehicles Act, which is a central act, and according to that, the court will give the rulings. So this thing happened in the case of Vikrams also. So Vikrams had been operating in the city since 1970s, and they were operating fairly all right until 2000, when the Regional Transport Office, they introduced a new set of actors in transport in Dehradun, which were these private city buses. And these city buses had a different permit. These city buses had public transport permit. They were given permits to operate from, say, point A to point B and all that. And then once they started operating, they saw that it's not that they didn't know it from before, but they will start operating first. And after that, they found that they were losing a lot of money because of Vikrams operating in the city and people preferring Vikrams over city buses. So they filed a case against Vikrams in the court, for which they were able to secure the verdict that the operation of Vikrams is illegal. Again, I think it is important here to understand that the court did not say Vikrams are illegal. Court said that operation of Vikrams is illegal. So that distinction, a lot of times the transport studies scholars do not make or do not understand. So with that, After that court ruling, the thing was that the operation of Vikram should have stopped because the court has ruled and now what to do. But the way the government controls transport or many other things is that we can see that there is increasingly this collapse of legislative and judiciary into executive. Executive is making decisions, executive is also fulfilling the decisions, and they are also passing the verdict. So with that, what happens is that the court verdict comes to the RTO, and when RTO is pushed to implement the verdict, they actually develop a cold feet. And they develop the cold feet because it is they who actually propagated the Vikrams at the first place. It is they who have been benefiting from operations of Vikrams through various means, which I do not want to say explicitly, but everybody would understand. So with this, they cannot implement that decision. And now, because the executive has become so strong, so powerful, they find the ways to go around that decision. They try to tweak the law, they try to tweak the rules of operation. They actually even try to give Vikrams the permits which will make them legal in their operation. But at the same time, these Vikrams themselves have been used to of operating in such a way that they also do not want to get into that perfectly legal definition of transport. So the whole scenario is such that everybody has been benefiting from this informality of operation. It is the state, it is the operators, and I will say it is also the passengers. Because if you go to Dehradun, people will say that they prefer to take Vikrams over city buses because Vikrams are faster. Vikrams do not stop at the stops for long, and Vikrams take only 5 or 6 passengers, which makes them very frequent. So a lot of people take these kind of vehicles. So in some sense, everybody is benefiting from informality in some sense.
It's very difficult to reform the rules and make these more formal or more legal because there are so many people who are interested in this existing, but not interested in giving it the formality, right? And one thing that you described in your paper that I was fascinated by is that for the most part, you feel like, oh, these Bikram drivers and owners, these poor people who are kind of stuck, in the shadow of this informal law. But on the other hand, they also benefit in the sense that when there is a central government mandate, for instance, which tries to bring in more public buses or public-private partnership buses, right? And they face a threat of competition from private buses, it is the Vikram owners and drivers who kind of form a lobby to prevent private buses from entering the city, right? And you see the opposite is also true, right? You see all these private bus operators, if and when they do manage to get a license to ply buses, they try and get the Vikrams outlawed. So it's almost, in a sense, a kind of competition, right, for scarce resource, which is the permission to drive on a fixed route. And all this is playing out, and the people who are benefiting from it the most, in some sense, are the political operators because they can potentially extract rents from both parties, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But there is tremendous work which has been done on shadow state. Jonathan Jaria is one person who comes to my mind immediately for this kind of work. So you see that this kind of shadow state always exists. And especially when there is any informal setting, informal market, there will be this shadow state which operates. But the thing is that this shadow state cannot operate by itself if it is not propagated by bureaucratic state.
Absolutely.
It is hand in gloves kind of thing which happens where bureaucratic state and shadow state benefit from each other, and that is why they are able to sustain.
Yeah. So you have this situation where there is sort of, very bad regulation, which is not thought out well. Plus, you have weak state capacity. So, they're not going to actually enforce that regulation. And then whatever is the limited state capacity looks the other way and profits from the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other thing my research does is that I problematize this particular understanding too. For that, I talk about how the state functions. And in this, I actually rely on philosopher Agamben and his idea of sovereignty, which he actually takes from Carl Smith. And Carl Smith says that sovereign is he who decides on exception. So basically, the transport in Dehradun has been operating in a state of exception.
Yes.
And how that exception is being created. The exception is being created by the sovereigns. And now we have to understand who are these sovereigns. General understanding in legal studies is that the constitution is sovereign. In India, constitution is sovereign. We have law, we have rule of law. Everything should function through law. But when I go and check the transport in Dehradun, I do not see it functioning through law. So then I investigated further and I checked that how has it been functioning. And there I relied on something which Judith Butler calls it petty sovereign. These are the low and high ranking bureaucrats who actually act like sovereigns in specific situations, in specific spaces, in specific times. And these sovereigns take the decisions which actually impact the operation of transport. So again, I will go back into the history of Dehradun. In 1970s, when Vikrams were introduced in Dehradun, before that, the transport in Dehradun was provided by these horse-drawn carts called Tongaj. And they were the people who were regulated by municipal corporation of Dehradun. When Vikrams were introduced, there was a hearing in Regional Transport Authority where Tanga owners, and you will be surprised to know that the lawyer who actually represented Tanga owners in that authority meeting was the first Chief Minister of Uttarakhand, Nityanand Swami. He represented them, the Tonga owners, in the authority meeting, and they actually said that we will go out of our livelihood if Vikrams are introduced. And the commissioner said that it is inevitable that you are going to go out of the business. It's better that you start applying for permits for Vikrams. If you apply for permits for Vikrams, we may think of giving you the priority over those permits. So you see, it was not the commissioner's place to say these things to Tonga owners, right? He's not the person who will judge what will stay, what will not stay. But at that particular time, this commissioner takes that decision, and that decision impacts the public transport of Dehradun even 40 years after.
And it's interesting that you point out this whole larger idea. I mean, in one sense, we're talking about very specific, public transport in a small town in India. On the other hand, you've, I think, correctly traced the entire question of sovereignty and sovereign and state function. Because as you rightly point out, we have a lot of centralization in the executive. So that's one thing that has gone on. The other part of it is there is a lot of delegated legislation, right? So you have something like the Motor Vehicles Act, or you have any, colonial or even modern law. But the law only spells out the bare bones, right? Then it says the power to make rules lies in such and such authority. And that authority is a, petty sovereign, typically a bureaucrat with a massive amount of discretion. And they are really the people running the show. And once in a way, you might get some relief from courts who can correct this kind of, centralization of power. But mostly, this is what is happening everywhere in India. I mean, you're just pointing it out to us in the case of the Motor Vehicles Act and this kind of Bikrams and their informality. But this is happening whether you look at unorganized sectors and garment factories. This is happening whether you look at Kirana stores. This is happening in the case of housing and slums. This is happening in virtually every aspect of Indian life. We are basically being governed by petty bureaucrats with massive amount of discretion.
True, true. I do not have much to add to it. You are absolutely right. I was just talking to a friend yesterday about the evictions which have been happening in Assam, right? And what is that? That is also bureaucrats actually acting in exception to the law because people have right to housing and there are court orders. We go back to 1980s, Olga Tellis case, where we talk about that people have right to housing and they should not be evicted without proper notices and there should be some place for them to rehabilitate and all. But everything has been functioning in the exception to that law. I don't know. I have no words to.
Yeah, it's a country run by exceptions and discretion. I know what you mean. I feel the similar frustration. I recorded an episode, last year. It was one of our early episodes in our podcast with Anuj Bhuvania. And, at some point, I think there was a level of hopelessness in our conversation. Because even though he has done so much work on this and I have read so much, we were kind of in shock that this is the state of affairs, or rather in despair that this is the state of affairs of how we run as a country and just the enormous amount of discretion. In his case, he was talking about the discretion in the hands of judges. In your case, you're talking about the discretion in the hands of the petty bureaucrat or the municipal corporator or something like that. But, it comes down to the same way as we think about governance, and we are treating our citizens as subjects. We're not treating our citizens as citizens, right? And I think it finally boils down to that. Now, I mean, I love having this broader conversation with you, but I also want to bring us back to urban transport and ask you about what are some of the implications of this kind of, complete mess in terms of a policy formulation, and therefore the informality and, illegality of Vikrams when it comes to congestion, when it comes to air pollution, when it comes to how we think about catering to the demand of a growing city. So what are some of those implications, if you can walk us through that?
Yeah, you're right about this. But my take on it would also be slightly different. I would say that generally the whole idea of congestion, whole idea of pollution, and all these things, this is very new, and this discourse is very middle class driven. So with that, you see that in Dehradun, the Vikrams were banned in 1996. It was around the same time when CNG vehicles were being introduced in Delhi, and a lot of things were happening in Supreme Court. They were looking at how to tackle the problem of transport and congestion at that point of time. So Vikrams were called polluting. Vikrams were called that they are creating congestion in the city. And because of that, there was a Supreme Court ruling actually, which banned the new permits for Vikrams in 1996. And if we see, rather than solving anything in Dehradun, it actually brought a new crisis in transport because there were no buses operating in Dehradun. The Vikrams were 794. 794 Vikrams were flying in Dehradun at that point of time, and the number of Vikrams were freezed at 794. And in 2000, the Dehradun becomes capital of Uttarakhand. And actually, the influx of people started in late 90s. If you see Dehradun's population in last 20 years, it has more than tripled. So when so many people come to a city to live and there are only 800 odd vehicles to cater to public transport, what will happen?
Private transport explodes, right? Everyone starts buying cars and two-wheelers, and you've basically made the congestion problem worse, which is exactly what happened in Delhi. It's like this problem is replicating city after city after city.
Yeah, the thing is that whenever anything happens like this, public transport becomes the first victim. And when I say public transport, I include quote unquote informal transport also. So they become the first victim for any drive which talks about encroachment, which talks about congestion, which talks about pollution, while a lot of private transport goes unchecked within this whole scene. So that is why I'm not very keen on that line of thought.
Well, I completely agree with you that just narrowly focusing on congestion and air pollution is a very middle class and elite preoccupation because we have other modes of transport. I've made that argument myself before, and we need to find cheap and accessible sources of transportation. Having said that, air pollution is a very big problem in India, especially
Right.
in the northern part of India, right?
Mhm.
And we know that it reduces on average, life and productive health. So I wonder if there is a way to think about a broader policy conception where we move out of maybe 5 to 7 passenger vehicles and maybe it is 20 passenger vehicles like, a jitney or a tempo, maybe it's a larger bus for some routes. I think we do need to rethink this. So I agree with you that banning Vikrams is not the solution, but is the solution allowing and providing permits for more new kinds of transport? Should we remove the distinction between fixed routes versus just private routes? What is the way to think about this problem and solve it?
You are absolutely right that Vikrams are not sustainable in themselves. I mean, when they started operating, the city didn't even have 100,000 population. Now it is a million plus city. So with that, of course, it becomes a bit problematic because if you have six, seven-seater vehicles, how many vehicles will you have? But if you see the state's interventions in last 20 years also in Dehradun, you will see the same thing that they will introduce a new set of vehicles and they will introduce busage. After busage, they actually introduced something called, locally it is called Tata Magic. It is a micro van. It is a seven, 8 seaters micro van. And it is mostly on the routes which are not well connected. So they introduced that. In last 3, 4 years, they introduced e-rickshaws in Dehradun. So what we see is that whenever there is a problem, whenever they see that a problem is growing and all that, a new set of vehicles suddenly come in the market. A new set of vehicles, and with it, it brings a new set of actors. So this has been happening like for last 3, 4, 5 times, and it doesn't solve the problem of transport, but it just makes it more and more complex because the old set of actors do not go away, but they just remain. It reminds me of work of Hannah Arendt. She talks about that how we keep trying to solve the problem through the same means again and again. So it's the problem of natality which we have to think about, that how to think of something new out of this system. And that is what we have not been thinking. So for me, it is not the solution that, okay, Vikrams are not catering to the transport now, so we just introduce a new set of vehicles. Rather than that, I would actually suggest that why don't you make Vikram owners a party to the solution? Why don't you start asking them that how to think of the solution? And especially because in Dehradun, city buses are also failing. When I visited the city last time in 2019, there were bus owners who were saying that we want to surrender our permits and we want to take the permits for smaller vehicles. So why is it happening like this? The government has to think about it and then they have to talk about providing any solution.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with you that it makes more sense that people who are closest to the demand end of things and who are actually catering to people's needs are the ones who provide the feedback bottom up on how to solve this transportation problem. On the other hand, I do see as India grows as a country and as economic activity increases, a greater role for buses and maybe jitneys and, a lot of flexible kind of transportation. I want to kind of loop back to the dissertation work that you have done specifically on buses, right? This is the big central government scheme that was introduced for urban transport, and a number of cities, especially all these smart cities, have taken up the government. They've brought in bus fleets. And you have specifically studied two hilly regions. One is Dehradun and the other is Shillong in Meghalaya. And these are both very important cities in that they house a large part of the population and economic activity within these states, right? So it's a very important hub in one sense. On the other hand, these are not your traditional huge metropolitan areas. They're very interesting cities where you can experiment with some of these measures, right? So they're small enough for that. And you find that there is a vast difference between what happened in Dehradun and what happened in Shillong, right? In Dehradun, any central bus schemes that were brought in, eventually they were never used for intra-city transport, right? They just got diverted to intercity bus transport. Whereas in Shillong, they were actually used for intra-city transport. But neither of these cities has a very happy ending. So can you tell us what is going on when there are these external schemes that are introduced to try and bring in more bus transportation, but it simply doesn't take, it just fails?
Yeah, thanks for asking this because that is one thing that my research in Shillong actually makes my research complete. In Dehradun, I have been researching for last 9 years now. So Dehradun was a city which I was more familiar with, but Shillong I went only in 2016. So it has been only 3, 4 years that I researched in Shillong. But it just gave me a different perspective. It is something which I talk about in my thesis also, a parallax view, which is a term coined by Japanese philosopher Karatini. So when from a distance we can see that the outcome of Jainanaram in Dehradun and Shillong was very different. And that is why the transport in Dehradun and Shillong is very different. In my thesis, I argue that it is essentially same. What is happening in Shillong may look different, but it is exactly the same thing. What is happening in Dehradun is that the government is introducing new set of actors without actually solving the problem of transport. I will just give a brief history of transport. In Shillong, there was public buses which have been operating in city since 1940s. So if we see that it is one of the oldest cities with public bus service. And that service had been pretty okay, let's say, until 1970s and 80s. But then in 70s, Meghalaya state came in existence. Before that, it was the whole state of Assam, right? And Shillong was capital of Assam. The whole of Northeast was state of Assam and Shillong was its capital under the British and after British until 1970. But in 1970, it becomes capital of this small state called Meghalaya. Meghalaya has a huge tribal population, and they wanted the state because they used to think that their areas are controlled by Assamese and Bengali population, and they wanted to take the control back. So when in 1970 the state came in existence, the other thing which happened is that the city buses started going out of business, and that was because these were controlled by Bengali businessmen, and the local population, which is Khasi, they wanted control of transport, and they started applying for permits. They start getting permits. They call it minibus. So you can see how the whole system of public transport was in some ways dismantled by this cultural politics of the city. Then comes to the liberalization in 1990s. The taxis come in and people start driving taxis. Right now there are almost 6,000 taxis in Shillong for a city of 300,000 population. I have never heard of any other city which would have that much density of public transport, let's say IPT, intermediate public transport. And these taxis, what will they do? How many people are going to book taxis? So they start operating like Vikrams in Dehradun on fixed routes. The same story repeats. The officials let them operate in on these routes and all that. But then comes 2010, Janaram comes, and with Janaram, they think of introducing these buses, the public transport buses, state-owned public transport buses in Shillong. By introducing these buses, they thought that they will actually transform the public transport of the city and people will start taking these buses. But what they didn't think is that it was the beast of taxi operators which they had created over the years, and it is not going to go away so easily. And especially in a place like Shillong, it is a very close knit community. Shillong is comprised of many localities which are called shnongs in local language. So shnongs are a kind of village. If we translate it into Khasi to English, it will be called village. But it is not village, it is locality in some sense. And the city had many shnongs, and these shnongs are controlled by the headmen, which are called Rangba shnongs. And these Rangba Shnongs are not elected people, they are selected among the people within the community. So, because it is a close knit community, even the taxis do not operate like routes wise in Dehradun, but they operate locality wise. They will have locality based taxi unions. And these localities, the entry to taxi unions, you have to be someone from the locality. No outsider can actually operate the taxi in locality. And these Rangba Shillongs are very powerful because Shillong comes under sixth schedule of Indian Constitution. So they have a higher degree of local self-governance. When the commissioner of urban development department tries to introduce the buses in Shillong, he could not imagine that he will face these resistance. And there are reports that when the buses were introduced, Rangba Shnongs issued the orders banning the operation of buses in the localities. And with banning these buses could not go to those localities. So the whole idea of introducing public transport in Shillong collapses in some sense. The other thing which happens is that they do not have any capacity to operate these buses. So what they do is they
Exactly.
give it to private businessmen to operate these buses. These private businessmen then give it to individual drivers and conductors who will operate these buses. And if individual drivers and conductors are operating these buses, then what is the difference between a state owned public transport and a shared taxi which has been already there?
Exactly. In fact, the shared taxi is even more flexible in that sense. You can understand even the demand side is not going to particularly respond to these individually driven buses. No, this is really fascinating. I mean, in some sense, I find that the more we try and centralize the problem and bring in all these union government scheme and these state government laws, some sense, the worse we make the problem, because the fundamental issue of who are the local stakeholders, right? And who are the interest groups that are really strong coalitions. We have not figured out, who they are and how to break them down in one sense. I'm just curious about, I know you've completed your PhD. In fact, in the job market series, I think yours is the only dissertation I have read completely. It was an absolute pleasure. It's a fantastic work, but what else have you been up to during the pandemic?
Not much, actually. Just trying to live day by day. I'm right now in Singapore. Singapore had been pretty all right for the last year, but then the cases started rising last 2 weeks, 3 weeks in Singapore. We have been in and out of lockdowns. Currently, we are in a state where it is not called lockdown, but many things are closed. Work from home is default by default. Dining in the restaurants is restricted to two. So yeah, with all these uncertainties, I'm trying to live day by day. I'm not thinking of much ahead.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, suddenly mass transportation and public transportation doesn't quite require much attention, right? It's a problem that kind of disappears into the background. So I'm sure it'll come back to the forefront as things open up.
Actually, I think it should not go to background. That is what is happening. I've just finished writing a paper on impact of COVID-19 on taxi drivers in Shillong, and it has been pretty bad. So I talked about exception and all, and it is, I think, zenith of exception that now the state is saying that on which days taxis can operate, on which days taxis cannot operate,
Exactly.
and all
Yeah.
that. So I think it should not go to background.
The most important question before we wrap this up, what have you been binge watching?
I'm a very bad binge watcher. So generally, if I start anything, then I do not do anything else before finishing it. I have stopped binge watching. The last thing I watched was The Chair on Netflix.
How did you find that?
I have my critiques of that. I mean, it was good, but as an academic, I think that it could be better.
I agree. But it was almost too close to reality, some of it, you know. I had the rest of my family laughing out loud and I couldn't quite laugh. But thank you so much for doing this, Gaurav. This was such a pleasure and I really enjoyed your dissertation. I must say that again, and I encourage everyone to read it and I hope you turn it into a book and a larger research program.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my work. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ideas of India. If you enjoy this podcast, please help us grow by sharing with like-minded friends. You can connect with me on Twitter at @SRajagopalam. In the coming weeks, we will feature weekly short episodes with young scholars entering the academic job market discussing their latest research on India. Also, check out our new initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com. The 1991 Project is an effort to revive the discourse on growth-centered economic reforms in India by focusing on the economic ideas that drove them. In the coming months, we will publish essays, data visualizations, oral histories, podcasts, and policy papers demystifying the Indian economy and the 91 reforms. You can see all the content and subscribe to our newsletter for updates at the 1991project.com.